Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. As many of you have joined us here on the program, you know that we've talked about something known as post-traumatic stress disorder. It is estimated in the United States about 3.6 of the population between 18 to 54 suffer from this. That's about 5.2 million people who have this as a course during the given year. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is a guest who actually suffered from PTSD for more than 25 years. And she had decided it was time, and she'd finally had enough, and it was time to get her emotional health back. So joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is the guest, Heal Your PTSD. And I'd like to welcome award-winning writer and Chief Hope Officer of Your Life After Trauma, our guest, Michelle Rosenthal. Michelle, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Daniel, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
You sound so excited because you've found a way to heal yourself from this, but this was some pretty tragic stuff that a lot of people tend to overlook.
You're so right. You know, so often it's easy based on the media, let's just start there, makes you feel like, well, PTSD only happens to combat veterans. And so for the rest of us in the population who have trauma, and trauma is ubiquitous in every life, it's easy to say, well, I didn't have combat trauma, so I must really be overreacting, and I don't really have as much of a difficulty with this as I think I do. And the truth of the matter is that trauma happens to everybody, and the causes that precurse PTSD include, of course, military combat, military sexual trauma, but also car accidents, major illnesses that are life-threatening, divorce, losing a loved one to any kind of death that you witness or that you hear about, domestic violence, child abuse, child sexual abuse. So when we talk about trauma, it's a very broad spectrum occurrence, and PTSD actually occurs in up to 20% of trauma survivors. So the statistic that you offered, which is, I know, the one that's the base that's given out by the National Institute of Mental Health, for those of us working in the industry actually feel that the number is much higher, because when you look at all of the unreported cases and the undiagnosed cases, that number jumps from 5 million way closer to about 25 million. So it's an interesting issue to discuss.
Well, there's no doubt about that. And one thing, that you said that is so key, I remember as I was looking through your book, Heal PTSD, is that, there were other things people weren't thinking about. Yes, we tend to attribute a lot of it to our returning veterans, but for instance, it was just a few months back I was doing a segment on cancer survivors and how the the rate of these people getting cancer, recurring is pretty high because of the fear that it's going to come back. So, there's some post-traumatic right there, because, the idea you have cancer, that's already bad enough, but then you go into remission or it seems to be cleared up, but you still live in the fear, but what if it happens again? It's already happened once. That's something to really think about when you think of cancer survivors in the United States.
Definitely, and now there are enough studies being done on these life-threatening illnesses that we know the correlation of PTSD. Studies have proven that 1 in 3 cancer survivors, that's 33% of all cancer survivors, end up with post-traumatic stress disorder. 1 in 4 heart attack patients, 1 in 4 stroke victims also end up with post-traumatic stress disorder. So your point is well made. We see this in a large amount of people. I do actually a lot of work in the cancer community. This weekend I'm going to speak at a cancer conference about PTSD and psychosocial distress. So you're right, and the reason that I wrote Heal Your PTSD, which is the book that just came out, and even my books previous to that, Your Life After Trauma, these are all books explaining how PTSD affects us, how it changes your brain, how it alters your identity, and most importantly, what do you do to reverse all of those alterations, because you definitely can heal.
Mm-hmm. Now, because of your experience, share with our listeners what PTSD actually does when it comes to brain function.
It's so critical to understand that. For a long time, as you mentioned earlier, I struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder for over 25 years. For the first 24 years, I didn't even know I had it. I wasn't diagnosed until extremely late in my experience, and for all of the years that came previous to my diagnosis, I just thought I was crazy. I literally would say to myself, look, Michelle, some people in this world are supposed to be crazy. You are one of them, so just do the best you can. But then when I started researching what is PTSD and how does it affect us, and especially now in the past decade, with so many advances in neuroscience and how we can image the brain and see what's going on, we know, for example, that during a trauma, the amygdala, your threat detection center, activates, which it should, and that puts you, the sympathetic nervous system puts you into your survival mode, your fight, flee, or freeze response. Naturally, you're supposed to come back out of that. Your parasympathetic nervous system, your parasympathetic system is supposed to come up and shift you so that if your adrenaline and your cortisol, your stress hormones have gone very high, if your blood pressure and your pulse have gone up, and all of your blood has rushed to your extremities to save you in survival mode, afterward, all of that's supposed to come down. Well, this represents a neurophysiological, biological, and chemical process that goes on in your brain. When that process gets interrupted, that's when we really start to see major differences in brain function. So, for example, the amygdala, your threat detection center, if it never gets the signal from the parasympathetic system to calm down, the threat is over, then your amygdala is going to keep pinging for threat constantly, everywhere. And that's one of the things, hypervigilance is one of the major categories of PTSD symptoms, and the amygdala feeds into that category because it's constantly looking for threat. We actually have seen in studies that the amygdala in PTSD survivors enlarges. It overworks so much you can think of it like a muscle, and it just gets bigger and bigger. At the same time, the hippocampus, also a little structure in your brain, is responsible for consolidating your memories and placing them from short to long-term storage. But cortisol, interestingly enough, interrupts the process of the hippocampus. It actually kills hippocampus cells, glucocorticoids. And so when that happens, your memories don't get properly placed or consolidated. In fact, they stay open in a loop, if you want to think of it that way, where the memory is constantly available in short term, which makes you feel like it's still happening, which makes you feel like the threat is still there. So when the hippocampus underfunctions, and we see from studies the hippocampus actually shrinks. It just from underfunctioning atrophies. And so you've got an enlarged amygdala and a shrunken hippocampus. And let me say right now, all of this can be reversed, so it's not critical, but it does change your brain function because in that state of hyper alert, feeling like you're always in danger, you're going to experience sleep disturbances, you're going to experience concentration issues, you're going to have trouble focusing, brain fog, emotional dysregulation, where all of a sudden you're just heroically courageous, or you are on the floor in a pool of water. So we see a lot of different dysregulations based on how trauma affects the brain, and this is just the bottom line. But I think it gives you enough to understand fully how this very common experience of trauma can become something that really sidelines a life.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talk about something that I don't think I've ever heard of before, healing rampage. Tell us about that.
Yeah, a healing rampage.
I can kind of guess this one. It's when you get so upset about something that you go nuts. And I remember, and that's just me, but I remember a time when I had some sort of an Asian flu that just came on to me like in no time. And what came along with that was something I'd never experienced, which was a migraine headache. And I'll tell you what, those things are maddening. I can't even imagine how people live with them, but there were moments that I just was beating my head against the wall out of just due frustration because it just seemed to be one of those situations that felt like it was never going to go away. So why not go nuts? Now, I don't know if that's a healing rampage, but it certainly was a rampage in my case at that particular time. So,
well, it definitely was a rampage. To add the healing component, I would ask you, what did you do to get better? And how did you do it?
Well, in that particular case, you just kind of allowed the course of action to go. By 2.5 days, it was just, now I'm just delirious. The pain was pretty much gone, but I was still pretty wiped out from what had happened. So you just kind of allowed, things to do what they do. So.
Well, and that's the beginning to me of what a healing rampage is, when we really engage in what has to be done to heal.
Right.
So for a long time in my recovery, I showed up to therapy every week, and I don't know where I got this idea, but I guess it was I was exhausted. I was sleeping 2 to 3 hours a night and not well and not all at one shot. And I was delirious with sleep deprivation and coping with symptoms and trying to avoid meltdowns. And so I thought my job was just get to the therapist's office. Once I'm there, he's going to do the work. And if you know anything about therapy, which I'm sure you do, that doesn't get you anywhere. I mean, it's great to show up, but you really have to engage and do the work. So to me, a healing rampage is when I got to the very bottom of the darkest day, and I realized, okay, I have to stand up, I have to find the courage and the strength and be brave and go into this problem full force. I have to commit, I have to dedicate, I have to follow through even when things are bad. And I started doing more research, and I started really showing up in therapy, and I started trying some alternative modalities, going whole hog into recovery with the intention I will succeed. That was the definition of my healing rampage, when I was going to accept nothing less than doing whatever it took to free myself from this thing that was holding me down. And anybody can do that. Each of us has a different healing process, so everyone can define a healing rampage differently, but the essence of the rampage is I will do whatever it takes until I'm done.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an important point for the listeners especially to understand, is when it comes to doing something, especially healing from something like PTSD, it takes effort. It isn't something where somebody kind of talks you through and paints colored roses, for a brief period of time, because this is something that's, as you were just describing, and brain function-wise, is pretty well embedded. It's the brain really trying to survive is what it is. And it's pretty interesting how, first of all, we know the plasticity of the brain, its ability to rewire and relearn and grow and do new things. And here you're replaying a tape of something that really isn't occurring anymore. So it's a way of really training yourself, I guess, to be back in reality again. Is that a way that you could look at this?
Definitely that's a component. That's why things like mindfulness, yoga, meditation, breath work, that's why those processes are so integral to the healing program overall. I really come at healing, and I've worked with so many survivors now as a post-trauma coach, but also I lead an enormous community on the HealMyPTSD.com website, where we have so much information about healing and PTSD education. And what I learned from all of the research and the training and my own personal experience, we really have to look at PTSD recovery as a comprehensive program. There's no one way to get it done. Everybody has their own personal process. And within that truth, I've really determined that we need a dual, like a parallel track. We need the traditional processes like talk therapy, behavioral therapy, cognitive, all of those things. Those are so critically important. And at the same time, like you were mentioning it just a few minutes ago, Daniel, all of this is really programmed in. Mm-hmm. So we also, I find great benefit in the alternative practices and modalities that access not just the conscious mind, but really target and access the subconscious mind, which, by the way, the sole purpose of the subconscious mind is to keep you safe. So until that subconscious mind is programmed in a way that it understands you are safe in the present moment, there's a lot of healing work that you can spin your wheels. because you have to pull together both the conscious and the subconscious in a program that also addresses the body. And when I see people do that, which is also what I did, I see success happen so often.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, what holds, I guess, people who survive from PTSD back from healing. It sounds to me that it's taking that action or having that healing crisis like you had, pretty much.
Well, I think that's such a seminal question, and in Heal Your PTSD, I do address the things that hold you back because it's such a critical point, and I think there are some really important ones. Number one is fear, and as odd as this may sound, healing is terrifying.
Sure it is.
I didn't even think about that in my recovery. Why would I be afraid to heal? I am so afraid to live the way I'm living. How could I possibly be afraid of changing it? But changing your PTSD habits, PTSD is a lifestyle based on helping you feel safe and in control. And in healing, we're asked to give up all of that stuff. For what? We don't even know yet. And so fear is one of the biggest things that I see hold people back, and resistance to engaging in the process, resistance to doing the tough work, and of course under all resistance you get back to fear. So I can outline a bunch of things that are obstacles, family and friends, colleagues who may be or may not be well-intentioned, but they don't always help support the recovery process. But at the end, usually I see the biggest obstacles come from fear within the survivor, him or herself.
Well, you think about what you just said when it comes to some of the things that may topple somebody from ever being able to recover, and you talk about friends and family. Now just think about this for a minute, that you're in this group and you found that there is a particular way for you to be when you're around these people. So you sort of build up these, what do we want to call them, I guess, social habits, if you will. And you said something so key as you were talking earlier, especially about how the brain functions and the hippocampus and how all that works, especially for someone with a PTSD mind. And I'm reminded of a psychologist I talked with a couple of years back, and she said something really fascinating as we were talking about goal setting, and this was actually in her book as well. And it made a lot of sense. She says, it takes a lot of energy for the brain to operate. Just think of all the non-voluntary systems that it operates. And so when it comes to doing something new, and this is for all of us, is that it tends to create a sense of aggravation for a little bit when it's a brand new thing. Let's say you're a right-hander and you decide you want to start writing with your left hand. Well, your brain starts saying, hey, what are you doing here? I just became efficient with all the other things that I'm supposed to be doing here, and it's taken me a lot of energy to do this, and now you want to add one more thing. Well, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to resist you a little bit, and that's where that conversation in your head goes on. Well, instead of learning to write with my left hand, maybe I can go and catch that show that I was really looking forward to, or I can go and do this other thing over here that's not as uncomfortable as learning to, let's say, write with your left hand. And she says, but you stick with it, and as you start, with your little successes, you begin to build those habits that, in the end, what you're eventually doing is you're writing with your left hand, and your brain goes back to saying, okay, I've mastered this now. Maybe it took me 20 or 30 days, whatever the case is. Now we can go back to business again, and I'm comfortable doing this. And I thought, that's an interesting way to look at it, especially in a realm of self-help where people pick up those books that promise us success through these, certain steps that you take, why those never work, and it's because of what happens when you're learning those new things. And with PTSD, it's the same thing. It's a stress, it's a trauma that's occurred. The brain learned how to survive it in the most efficient way possible. It learns and teaches you to live that way with it. And so it's pretty scary stepping out there on the edge of something that seems unfamiliar with the way that you were doing things, and you can see why it's difficult to take those first several steps, as you were talking about the healing rampage, so to speak.
Definitely, and really that's the beauty and the curse of the brain, is exactly what you're talking about, is that in the brain it learns best by repetition. But we always have, when we're coming up against a change, there is always that fear. Is it going to go well? Is it going to succeed? Even if you're just learning to switch hands with writing, there's that resistance. With PTSD, I mean, you're asking me, I remember thinking during my recovery, wait a minute, giving up my anxiety, which helps me feel safe and connected, I'm going to be in danger. If I give up the coping mechanisms I have, I am going to be vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And that's a frightening thought for a PTSD survivor. And, of course, it's a process of understanding you're actually going to be safer, because one of the many PTSD ironies is that the coping mechanisms you put in place to keep you safe and in control are actually the very mechanisms that are making you unsafe and out of control. Mm-hmm. And when we try to change, one of the things I love about the new neuroscience and the developments and the research is how truly we know, it's a fact, the brain changes in response to experience. Now, we know that. We have a trauma and we're changed, right? But one of the problems in PTSD is that we tend to think, I'm stuck this way now. But the beauty of the brain is that the brain is always willing to change. And it goes back to exactly what you were saying about goal setting and the repetition. The brain learns through two different methods: massed practice over a short amount of time very quickly, or repetition over a longer amount of time. Both ways, the brain learns. And you can build new neural pathways, and the more often you repeat a practice, the more strongly those neural pathways become embedded, and the more quickly they function, because the brain works on efficiency. So it can seem like a really hard job to heal, and it is, but there is science that proves the brain can change. And when we commit to putting into place those repetitive practices, we can see changes. I can give you an example from my own recovery. One of the first things that my therapist taught me to do was transcendental meditation. Now, you're taking a trauma survivor who is very uncomfortable in her body and in the present moment and asking her to sit still in her body and be present. It was, forget it. I can't do that. And so right away I resisted it. And then he made me a tape, so I didn't have to work very hard. I could just listen to the tape. And over a month, I put in place a daily meditation practice. And Daniel, the change after 2 months was enormous. Instead of being high anxiety all the time, I went down from a 10 to about a 4 or a 5, which was huge for me. Mm-hmm. I felt more rested. I felt more centered. I felt more in control. So all of the anxious behaviors that I had needed to help me feel in control, now I had a different way to feel in control, and I could let go of those behaviors and I built a transcendental meditation practice that was an hour every day, not the 15 or 20 minutes that he had suggested. So we really can see that it works.
Mm-hmm. Now, I like one of the things to take a look at, too, is PTSD, especially in the initial stages as it began to be recognized, was treated more from a mental perspective rather than a physiological one, which is something you talk quite a bit about in your book. Physiologically speaking, if you understand that's where this is, then you realize, okay, maybe I am more empowered than I thought I was to do this. It's going to take work. You roll up your sleeves. And just to give you an idea of how much work this could possibly be, and I'll read this from your book because I really thought this was an interesting piece of information, 88% of your brain is subconscious mind, and it records approximately 20 million bits of environmental stimuli per second. It's 20 million per second. And that compare that to 40,000 bits of information that your conscious mind, which you're aware of, is taking in. Now, that's a pretty big iceberg when you've created a habit down into the subconscious level, which anybody who's actually studied human motivation understands the subconscious mind's running the show.
To put it bluntly, you're so right, and that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. That's why I so advocate getting beyond talk therapy and adding other things into the mix, because if you just sit in talk therapy, which was huge for me, it helped me, talk about breaking an iceberg, it helped me really create a lot of fissures in my PTSD iceberg. So I think talk therapy has many benefits. At the same time, you're only talking to the 12% of your brain that's conscious. All that talk doesn't change the 88%, which is where all of your beliefs, all of your long-term memory, and all of your motivation and your associations are held. So it's critical to get to that 88% in whatever way feels comfortable to you. There are so many different ways to do it. But it really is critical, because when we start reprogramming the subconscious mind, then we start waking up in the morning, and instead of thinking, I'm in huge danger, we wake up thinking, I feel okay right now. Mm-hmm. And just that one shift changes the way you go into your day.
Mm-hmm. You know, what I want to encourage the listeners about your book especially is that it's, for one, very easy and very encouraging and really enthralling and consuming to read. I know those seem like a lot of big words for PTSD, which is just 4 letters, but, you know, it made me think of something that I suppose we could initiate with our audience, because PTSD, well, I don't have that. That's for, you know, like you were saying earlier in the program, veterans returning from war, or perhaps there was a rape victim, whatever, you know, those are extreme cases. But let's take a case that I know a lot of Americans have faced that would create PTSD, or let's call them mini PTSDs. Either way, it's pretty big for whoever seems to be experiencing it. You lost your job. Mm. You know, you carry that trauma if you get hired to a new job. You're always kind of looking over your shoulder waiting for that rock to drop, aren't you?
Absolutely, especially when you think about 2008 and how everything tanked in the markets. I actually, when I was writing Your Life After Trauma, my earlier book, which came out in March of this year, I interviewed a business coach just because I wanted to get a sense of the trauma of financial disaster from a professional, work perspective. And she shared with me the story of one guy who got fired on Wall Street, just lost his job, and he didn't want to have to tell his family. He had a wife, he had 3 kids, and a huge mortgage out on Long Island. And what was he going to say? What were they going to do? How were they going to live? And he literally, for months, still got up at 5 a.m., still took the 6 o'clock train into New York City, and sat on a bench on Wall Street because he didn't want anyone to know. So when you're dealing with shame and guilt and fear over how am I going to provide for my family? How is my family going to survive? And you can't find a job, or it takes you a long time, and then you get into the job and you don't feel stable, you're so right, because PTSD shows up to me, this is not a clinical, what I'm about to say is not clinical. Mm-hmm. It's just a perspective. But to me, there is a PTSD spectrum. There are some people who are high functioning with PTSD and some people who are low. Some people who have lots of nightmares, some people who never have a nightmare, some people who have flashbacks, others who don't. So within the category of symptoms, and I should say that if someone's listening and you're thinking, how am I supposed to know if I have PTSD? A good place to start, which is where I started with my own journey, is a PTSD self-test. And on the healmyptsd.com website, on the symptoms tab, we have the exact self-test, actually, that I took when I started. And it's 22 questions, and it starts to give you a good idea of what's showing up for you, what's in your past, and then how you score on the possibility. And then from there, of course, you need a professional to clinically diagnose you, but it can give you a good background. Mm-hmm. But what we see is so much what you're saying, Daniel, which is that there are so many different varying factors in everyday life. You know, one of the biggest things that surprised me when I started doing research was that child neglect is a precursor for PTSD. And wow. I thought, how could that be? Mm-hmm. It does, right? But at first it's like, nobody hit this child, nobody was unkind to this child. What are they, like, how could they have PTSD? But of course, a child who's neglected is terrified. They don't know where's their next meal coming from, who's going to take care of them. So we really, I think, we need to advocate for a different perspective about PTSD and how it occurs and in whom it occurs. Mm-hmm. And that would really help so many people and reduce the stigma, which would allow more people, I think, to come forward and get diagnosed and get help.
Now, you say stigma, so from your experience, what exactly does that look like?
Well, I see that so many different ways. Let's separate out now from the military and civilian because it shows up in different ways in each. Some that overlap, but literally in the military, I've spoken and worked with so many veterans who have said, if I even let the military know that I'm struggling with this, that's it for me. My career will be over. Now, the military is working hard on destigmatizing PTSD. It's why they're advocating dropping the D, so it's just post-traumatic stress. I personally like the D for my own personal reasons. I like that it's a disorder that I can do something about. It's not just stress, like it just sounds like everybody has stress. So I like the D, but in the military, they're working very hard to create more of a culture where it's okay to have a mental health issue. It's not weakness, which is traditionally what it's been seen as. Mm-hmm. And in the civilian world, of course you have that, but there's a huge stigma in the civilian world that you should just be able to get over it. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, well, why can't you just let it go? There's a stigma around the idea that we're holding on to it and we're creating this for ourselves. And the truth is, my God, if you've ever spent one day with PTSD, you would let it go like a hot potato if you could.
Yeah, I can imagine you would, definitely.
So those are two examples. There are many, but those start to give you a sense of where the stigma comes in, and the media, frankly, doesn't help, because then when you go for a job interview and someone wants to know why you haven't been at work or why your work history is sporadic, if you share I have PTSD, what's the first thing they think of? Crazy people, veterans who are running for cover. They don't think about, well, we're just as normal as other people. We just are dealing with stuff. Are we a little more jumpy? Yes. Can that interfere with our work? Absolutely. But there are a lot of other people who have things that interfere with their work that they just haven't had diagnosed yet. It doesn't mean we're incompetent.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I wanted to bring up, because I think this is so valuable about what you write here again, as you read through this book, Heal Your PTSD, you'll find that you're really beginning to self-reflect and pay attention to your inner worlds a lot more. I would imagine, as I've had probably a little bit of experience with PTSD, especially in the world of social work, is that, even as we've been just pointing out, there are a lot of people that could have it, and you don't just connect it with veterans, as the media tends to say. There's always those extreme examples. For instance, what was it, the sergeant down in Texas that shoots people on a military base? Well, that's PTSD. So we see extreme examples, but I didn't want to use those because it's easy to see how in everyday life a lot of us could be having this. As I described, the loss of a job, you lose your home in foreclosure. There's the sense of extreme loss is one of those things that I think a lot of us experience at one point or another in our lives, and some of us, well, what's the gift in this? And they move on and they think, well, this was actually a blessing, whereas, as you were saying, there are these children that are neglected. They grow up so they don't have that sense of who can I go to when I have trouble. So therefore, they're probably more susceptible to having PTSD when a traumatic experience occurs because they haven't learned to cope with it. But going back to your book, it's about that inner reflection and getting that intuitive self to speak again, because that's something that I think we might tend to, with PTSD, put aside thinking, I don't have that voice anymore. I don't have that intuitive voice anymore. And it sounds like that's something that probably you have experienced as well as people that you've worked with.
Well, now you're touching on a topic, Daniel, that is super close to my heart. Mm-hmm. Because you're so right. I think one of the biggest sadnesses about PTSD is that we start to believe we are this damaged person, and that's all that we are all the way to our core. And that is an erroneous statement. It's a falsehood. It's a limiting belief, and it is just flat out wrong. I don't know how many different ways I could say it, because one of the things that I started doing in my own recovery, I was working in New York City at the time. I was teaching at a university downtown, and so every day I walked to work. And when it became very apparent to me that I was so disconnected, I dissociated a lot meaning, you leave the present moment, your mind just floats away. And so one of the things that I had to really work on in my recovery was learning to keep myself present. And one of the things that came out of the self-reflection that I did on that subject was I am so disconnected from who I am at my core. I am just this survivor floating through the world. And so in order to reconnect with that intuitive self, I decided to practice, now we're getting back to that idea of repetition, I decided to practice deferring to that self in moments that were inconsequential, because you can't start deferring to that self in really big stressful moments. You have to build up a relationship with it. And so I started walking to work instead of, I was always going the safest, the fastest, the most efficient route. And instead of using my head, I started using the feeling in my body, which is a lot of where we connect with our intuitive self. And I started just allowing myself to walk to work depending on intuitively, should I turn here, should I go straight, should I go left? I didn't use my head. I just tried to go inside and listen to the messages I was getting. It was a ridiculous exercise, but it worked to get me back in communication with that intuitive self. And what I discovered from, years of practice and now all the research and the work that I've done is this. I see us as perfect human beings with a core that is amazing, strong and courageous, and always able. Then trauma is like this huge garbage truck that comes along and dumps all this stuff on us and buries us. Now, you could say that underneath all that garbage, you'll never come out. You are now this pile of garbage. But the truth is that when you pull me out of the garbage, or when I claw my way out of the garbage, which is really more accurate, and I go and I get cleaned up and I take a shower, I still am the same person that the garbage was dumped on. I still have this beautiful core. I still have this courage. I still have this ability to be effective. And it's reconnecting with and reclaiming that connection that is so essential to the PTSD recovery process.
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you, this is just such a fascinating subject and a thing to be talking about, again, because you begin to see the more we've unraveled here that it isn't just, veterans, but there are many ways that people experience this. And I'm on your website now, which is healmyptsd.com, and there you are. You're doing an interview on a news station during Emotional Week talking about the Boston terror attack. See, there's a way that this reaches into a lot of lives outside of war. It's just really amazing just how potentially common this really is.
It is, especially when you think about, let's just talk about natural disasters, hurricanes, tsunamis, anything that threatens your life. Even, we had that tragedy of that shooting in Oregon a couple weeks ago, or I actually live in Palm Beach Gardens now, which is, 2 weeks ago, a white cop killed a black musician, and there's been a lot of trauma and rallies in my community. Survivors come from all walks of life with all types of traumas. But here's what's interesting. When I first finished my recovery, which was almost 10 years ago now, I didn't know what to do with myself. Daniel, I was 40 years old. I had no job, no career, no relationship, no family except my original family, and no friends, because PTSD had just wrecked me. And so I came out of my recovery like 40, but really 22. I had no life. It was like coming out of college. What do I do now? And I thought, well, I've always been a writer since I was 7. So my trauma was I was 13. So I went back to, let me connect to something I've always been, and let me start rebuilding from there. And so I decided I'll just start writing about what I've just experienced in terms of PTSD. And my brother, ever my techno friend, said to me, if you're going to write about this, do it on a blog. Get out of your own head and just do it in the world. And so I started a blog about my PTSD recovery, which, Daniel, because my trauma was so rare, I didn't think anyone would understand what I was talking about, because I thought if you didn't have my trauma, you couldn't understand my PTSD experience.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, I wrote, and I wrote, and I wrote. And here's the interesting thing. The very first people to start commenting on my blog and sending me email started writing things like, how do you know exactly how I feel? Or, you just put into words what I've been trying to express for 20 years. How did you do that?
Mm-hmm.
And these people, Daniel, they were veterans. Veterans were the first people to respond to what I was saying, and their response was, how do you know exactly how I'm feeling? And so, of course, I wrote back, I have no idea. I don't know how I know that. I'm just writing how I feel.
Right.
But it was very interesting. And the website that you're looking at today, healmyptsd.com, grew out of the fact that this little blogspot blog that, like, in the middle of nowhere that I had started became this oasis in the desert of PTSD. And we had everybody. We had veterans, domestic violence, child abuse, rape, you name it, they were there. Mm-hmm. And that was really educational for me because so often we feel alone and isolated. And PTSD fosters that kind of thinking. Depression is so rampant in the PTSD experience. And so you already feel bad about yourself. And so then you feel even worse because you feel nobody can understand this. I'm the only one that feels like this. And the truth is there are millions of us who feel like that. And that's really important to understand. And it's one of the reasons we launched the Heal My PTSD Forum, which is completely free. We have survivors from around the globe, everybody coming in and sharing their thoughts, their ideas, their questions. And that's the power. You know, we don't heal in isolation. We heal in community. And it's through connection that we can even find more courage to change.
Mm-hmm. That's so true about healing in communities, to know that you can be supported, that somebody out there has had an experience like yours, not your experience, but like your experience, that really can embrace and understand what you possibly are feeling because of the experience they've had with their feelings. Much as like what you just talked about, the veterans, you know, saying, how do you know how I feel? Well, I don't. But I know that this is how I felt, and it seems to me we've got a common ground that perhaps we can come together on this. Now, in your book, well, you know, there are a lot of really great key elements here, but I think the first thing we talked about earlier is you've got to really relearn a new habit. You had an experience that created, you know, an experience that you had that you're reliving, a traumatic experience, because you're learning to survive, so you feel like you're in survivor mode quite a bit, and I'm sure you must have felt that way for 25 years. You know, how am I going to get through this? But what I like about one of the things that you talk about here is, in this, you have to have the courage to decide this is what you really want. And so pulling yourself forward is a necessary habit. To realize I'm about to maybe step into a situation that seems or feels traumatic somehow. I'm reliving this feeling even though right now that's not what really happens. And then what you say is, when you're in that moment, because think about emotions, they're just sort of like little radars that tell you about what's going on in the world. And sometimes that emotional radar maybe isn't functioning the way it should, especially if you've had trauma in your life. But feel that radar and then stand there, and then, as you say, you pause. You slow things down because it allows you to be more flexible and more aware of what the situation actually is. And that could be good for anybody, whether you're suffering from PTSD or not.
You're so right. And to add to that, so many of the healing processes that are healthy, that we put in place to create the recovery outcomes that we want, are so wonderful for living a life long after that. My transcendental meditation practice started in 1998. I still do it every day today because it's good for me, because it feels good. That process that you just referenced from Heal Your PTSD, the slow down, the pause, the reflect, assess, then make a choice, then take an action, that is great for chunking down how to heal. It's also fantastic for doing anything in life. It's about becoming more intentional with the way you show up and the way you react and respond so that you are more in control. every step of the way.
And to get a better idea of how that all looks, watch the movie starring Bill Murray, What About Bob?
Oh, yeah.
Now, I like what you say also here in the book, and I think this is so important because I know that people who have PTSD or have experienced or suffered from this must question, is there a God? Do I really have a soul? And you say here, regardless of the traumas you've survived, your core self remains constant like an eternal flame. Describe what that means.
It means that we are born as beings who are capable of love and joy and happiness. And trauma, and especially PTSD, which flattens your emotions, can make you feel like, that's not possible. I don't have access to any of those things. And even in my own recovery, when I got to a point where I was just, like the next step would have been suicidal, things were so bad, the despair was so huge, and that little intuitive voice that I had been practicing getting in touch with, this little intuitive voice said to me, what you really need, Michelle, is something opposite. You need to feel something opposite of this despair. And for me, that little voice decided I needed to feel joy. And I thought, well, that is just the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I can't feel joy. There is no way I could feel joy. But through a process that I put in place that was completely off the cuff, I put in place a little joy quest. And I decided every day I was going to feel a little bit of joy, even if it was just for 30 seconds. And for me, I discovered what I really could feel joy when I was dancing, but only when I was dancing. So, okay, I'd better dance every day, I decided. And, when I was living in New York City, I could go to a club any night of the week. But then I moved to this teeny-weeny little beach town, and we don't have nightclubs. So where was I going to dance? I literally signed up for a dance class at a local dance studio every day of the week to force myself, here we are back at that idea of repetition and training the brain, forcing myself, even on days I hadn't slept, even on days I'd been crying all morning, I went to the classes to connect with that core self that could feel something good. And that works because that core self, that eternal flame, it's biologically, that's who we are. It's in our DNA. Babies are born and they smile and they laugh, not because they've been taught to do that, but because naturally as humans, that's who we are. And so to me, that's always available somehow, some way. And we don't have to judge it. It doesn't have to be, I felt joy on a scale of 1 to 10. It was a 9.7. It can be a 0.3. And that's your baseline, and you build from there. But it's there. It's accessible, and it's just learning how to access it that is what allows you to fan that eternal flame.
Mm-hmm. You say something that I think is a very valuable tip that all of our listeners should take away from this, and I'm reminded of best-selling author Ken Blanchard, who wrote The 1 Minute Manager. And I was listening to him on a tape series one time, and he said something that to me was one of the most profound things I had heard when it came to the area of setting goals and self-help and just good living. And that is, he says, one of the most tragically overlooked things is that people don't tend to celebrate the little wins. As you said, if I could just have joy for 30 seconds doing a dance move, if I could just enjoy a feeling of peace and unknown, why I'm happy right now for 3 minutes, if I could come to recognize that I've had at least that much time of joy and happiness or compassion, whatever the case is, that's a win. I should celebrate that. And what's fascinating about this, and I know that this must be true from your experiences, as you celebrate, what you're also doing is you're giving gratitude. And anybody who gets in the practice of gratitude, of feeling grateful, whether it's 30 seconds on the dance floor or 5 minutes and a cup of coffee just looking out at a beautiful sunrise or a sunset, you celebrate that. When you're grateful for it, that means you have consciously made a choice that is the direction that you want to go. Now, that being said, with PTSD, people probably feel like they don't have a choice, but you clearly say in your book, yes, you do, but what are you willing to do to be sure that you have those choices?
And what are you going to do to create actions? It's great to have choices. It's great to have desires. Those are two essential pillars. They're not going to get you far enough unless you pair them with an action. And Heal Your PTSD, that whole book is driven by making the choice and taking the action. So every part of that book is offering readers what's the action. And it's personalized because for each of us the action is going to be different.
Absolutely.
Long before I discovered dance, I knew that this is so silly, but when I was living in New York City, I would go into Central Park just to see the green and be near a tree. And I would close my eyes and just focus on the feeling of the gentle breeze on my face. I don't know why. It made me feel peaceful. It made me feel the word you used, grateful, that I could feel something like that. And that's really, it's great to read the theories. It's great to self-reflect. It's great to educate, which is crucial, and do the research. It's great to have support and community, all these things. The one thing that is essential, the key to making all of that work, is taking the actions. Mm-hmm. And that's where we get back to the importance of the rampage, right? Because a healing rampage is really about the action and follow-through.
And it's a loose term for me to say this, but I think of healing rampage as I'm pissed. Let's do something about this.
Yeah, absolutely. That is so true, Daniel, because that was where my rampage was born from. Like, I refuse to live the rest of my life like this. Mm-hmm. I will not accept that.
Mm-hmm. What would you say, from your experience, was the special gift that you got from the PTSD experience?
Oh, I think there are many. I mean, post-traumatic growth is documented, so I know that occurs. In my personal experience, I would say that the gift that it gave me was it made me create the person I wanted to be. It's so easy. We're born, we fall into the habits and the patterns of the families in which we're raised, and then we do what we're supposed to do, quote unquote. We go to school, we go to college, we get a job, we start a family, we do all those things. But how often do we really stop, pause, take a step back, reflect, assess, is this what I want? Is this who I truly want to be? Am I all that I can be? I think with trauma and really particularly with PTSD recovery, we are forced to self-reflect, to choose, to define who we want to be. And this gets back to what I was saying earlier about identity. The identity component is huge and so important in the recovery process. And that is the gift when you're done, that you have created the self you chose, the self you defined, the self you desired, which means from there you create the life you choose, you define, you desire. And to me, that is the most satisfying life to live. And I don't mean that in a selfish way because we can do all of that in conjunction. I mean, since my recovery, I fell in love with my dance instructor, and we're still together today, and we've built an entire life together. So you don't have to choose, desire, and create alone. But when you're doing that so intentionally, as PTSD recovery requires you to do, the gift is that you live your true core self going forward in a way that I don't think I ever would have lived before. I would have just done what I was supposed to do. I was good like that. You follow the path. Mm-hmm. And now I'm creating a path that's really tailor-made for me, and to me that is the greatest gift.
And I think what you hit on is something that is very clearly needs to be understood is this is not a linear path. You don't just take step 1 through 5 and you've achieved the end goal, as many self-help books would actually tend to have you believe. And in fact, I think your book probably on the shelf in the bookstore is in the wrong section.
Where do you think it should be?
I think it should be in an area of success, because when you really take a look at the principles that you're outlining here, to me, they really have, and I say this from my opinion, is there's a very spiritual approach. And when I say spiritual, it doesn't have a denomination. We're just talking about soul here. That it has that approach for you to really become the kind of person you really want to be, to have the things in life you really want to have. And when I see someone like you who's a keynote speaker, you're an award-winning blogger, a nominated author, all of it, you realize here was somebody that took their life that seemed to be almost, and I'm sure you probably felt hopeless at times, that dark night of the soul, but you made the choice and you took the actions that led you to have all of these marvelous gifts up to and including being with your dance instructor. I mean, who would have seen that as an outcome? But, the fact is this is good for everybody, so don't look at it PTSD, well, I don't have that. Look at this as a possibility to say, well, if that's the worst thing that can happen, what is the best thing that can happen for me? And initiate a lot of the exercises that you talk about in here.
You're so right, because really PTSD, whether you have the label or not, I think the point that we've really made here today so well is that everybody experiences trauma. And, we didn't even get to, let's just define trauma, which, my apologies, I should have done that right off the bat. But, when we define trauma, my top 3 favorite definitions of trauma, number 1, any moment that is less than nurturing. I mean, we all have those. Mm-hmm. Number 2, an experience that overwhelms your capacity to cope. We all have that too. And that so much is tied to the loss that you were speaking of earlier. And number 3, an experience that changes how you see your place in the world. So we don't have to be talking about life-threatening circumstances to recognize that trauma comes into every life and it changes us, just like every experience changes us. But we are fluid beings, which means we can change again. And what you're really saying about Heal Your PTSD is that the book itself is a program, a personalized program for change. It's sort of like, I look at the book like do you remember those create your own adventure books?
Right.
When I was a kid, and you could read any page and it didn't matter the order.
Right.
And I see Heal Your PTSD that way. You can pop into any page at any time and take something out of it to use in the day that you're having in a way that relates to your day specifically. Mm-hmm. And to me, because there's no linear process, that's the kind of program we need to heal, something that flexes, something that's fluid, and something that allows us to go left and then right, forward, back, up, down, sideways, whatever it is, because we heal most effectively when we acknowledge, validate, and interact with where we are that day. Mm-hmm.
Here's an interesting thought that we can certainly leave our listeners with here. For those, PTSD, I don't think I have that. Okay, well, good. Okay, so when you go to work tomorrow, what I suggest you do as your homework is I want you to go in and ask your boss for a raise. How many people are willing to do that? You see the trauma right there?
And the rejection and the fear, absolutely.
But none of that has happened yet.
Right.
You haven't even went in tomorrow to ask your boss for the raise. I'm just saying tomorrow I want you to go in and tell your boss you want a raise. See?
Right.
And imagine how many people listening now are thinking, I don't know if I can do that. See, there's your trauma. You've got post-traumatic stress disorder right there.
Well, all right, Daniel, I'm gonna step out of that circle because I think it's important not to minimize really what PTSD is and the experience of it. But the point you're making is so true, that we all have fears.
Right.
And at the bottom of it, that's what PTSD is. It's an enormous, uncontrolled fear. Mm-hmm. And it's addressing that fear and putting it back in its proper place and retraining the brain and the body to live in a state of safety and presence that's true and appropriate, that's really the hallmark of a recovery process that succeeds.
Very good. Well, Michelle, I want to thank you for taking the time to spend the hour with us to talk with our listeners about how they can heal their PTSD. As we've seen, it's varied from person to person. That's how your book works. It's varied for people to actually realize that it isn't a one-size-fits-all, but you can uniquely approach this and that you can heal from it After all, you said you had it for 25 years. You learned to live with it. You got sick of living with it. You did something about it. The one thing I have to ask you, though, is on your website, healmyptsd.com, is what role does your associate there play?
Who do you mean?
The one that's sitting next to you on the steps.
Oh, I thought that's who you meant, but then I didn't know if you meant my assistant Lee, who's also listed on the site. Bailey is he's the company mascot. He actually, I'll share with you, Daniel, Bailey is my 12-and-a-half-year-old Wheaten Terrier, and if you've never seen a Wheaten Terrier, they are super cute. They look like stuffed animals, and they're always so full of joy. And he was, when I first got him, my first step in recovery. I literally made the commitment to getting him because I decided I wanted to live. Mm-hmm. And if I was going to live, I needed something that kept me connected to a sense of happiness. And I mean, if you've ever had a puppy, we all know what they do, right?
Oh,
You
yeah.
can't resist them. So he's still, he's under the desk right now. He's still my best bud, and he's been amazing, and he is with me everywhere and always represents hope to me, because that's really where my recovery began. It began with hope, the hope that I could feel better, the hope that I could succeed. I didn't know if I could. I didn't know how I would. I just hoped. Mm-hmm. And from there, everything, I wouldn't say it fell into place, but that's what drove me every day, was the hope. Even on the worst days when I felt like I was failing, I just kept focusing on the hope. And Bailey was a great way to help me do that, whether it's a dog, a cat, or an iguana, having something to love and that helps you connect to yourself in the present moment in a pleasurable way is always helpful.
So I'm guessing that your next book is going to be something along the lines of Finding Your PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress dog. Dog being the metaphor, of course. You said iguanas are acceptable as well, or parakeets.
Yeah, definitely. I am working on a new book, but it's not about dogs. It's more about creating, we have so many books about healing, which I've contributed to, and this next book is really about living your life. Mm-hmm. It's not about the healing process. It's about living your life as a free trauma survivor, as someone who has moved beyond all that stuff. We really don't have any literature about, well, what do I do now? And so that's sort of where I'm leaning toward for my next book, to keep the narrative going. My first book, Before the World Intruded, was a memoir of my PTSD recovery, so it's like a case study of success. And then the next book was Your Life After Trauma, Powerful Practices to Reclaim Your Identity. So it was just a process for identity work. And then Heal Your PTSD is more comprehensive for the whole recovery process. But then what do we do after that? When you're ready and you're finished and you're healed, then what? So I think that may be the direction I go next.
Well, very good. We'll look forward to that. Again, the book is Heal Your PTSD. Our guest today, Michelle Rosenthal. For our listeners, one more time, please give out your website information.
Absolutely. And you know what? I am remiss if I don't tell everybody that when we were talking so much about the brain and the effects on the brain, we have a free webinar series on the healmyptsd.com website that explains everything in way more detail than we were able to get into today, along with how to reverse it. Because it's great to understand how your brain changes, and then you really need to know what to do about it. So healmyptsd.com has a free webinar series all about that. And we also have over 100 different podcasts, I think it's over 200 by now, of interviews with healing professionals and survivors. Because my whole thing is, we could talk about how bad PTSD is, but that's the easy part. The hard part, which is where I like to focus, is what do we do? How do we heal? Where is success? And so all of these podcasts are survivors and neuroscientists and clinicians talking about what it takes to get the work done. And all of that is at healmyptsd.com, which is also where you can join our free forum. So there's a whole community. Nobody ever has to be alone, because every single one of us has enormous healing potential. The goal is learning how to access it. And so the more you reach out, the more you research, the more you read, and the more you try, the more you figure out what that looks like for you. So, Daniel, thank you so much today for caring about this. I deeply appreciate it.
You bet. It's something we like to provide to our listeners to show that these things are possible, and you've certainly shown that it's not only more than possible, but it's actually very doable. And thank you for being on the program today.
It's my pleasure.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. You can also discover more by visiting us at Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. Sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. You can also follow us on Twitter at Beyond50Radio, as well as Facebook. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 Radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.